My name's Peter Beatty. I'm an anaesthetist from Scotland, and I'm here to give you a brief insight into my experience with digitising our theatre suite, focusing particularly on the introduction of our anaesthetic electronic patient record. From a disclosures point of view, I'll receive honoraria and travel for this talk. That said, all the thoughts and opinions I express are my own. So I work in Forth Valley Royal Hospital, which is a district general hospital in the geographical centre of Scotland. We've got about 440 acute beds, 16 operating theatres, and the usual collection of surgical specialties. We've no tertiary referral centre, so no cardiac, neuro, or specialist paediatrics. As you can see, we are blessed by being surrounded by nature, and there are not many hospitals in Scotland where you can have a woodland walk or a 10k trail run from the back door in your lunch break. I consider myself very much a generalist clinically, and prior to this project I had no specific skills in IT or systems or services. So our digital journey began for me in August 2020 with the start of the Opera project. Opera was chosen as the system we used to bring us in line with some neighbouring health boards which were already using the system and to facilitate cross-border working. Thankfully, as part of that project, we were able to persuade the board to include the Centricity High Acuity Anaesthesia module as well as a sister product, and then install the two sequentially. Prior to this, our recording was from an end-of-life theatre management system and an entirely paper-based documentation of the anaesthesia record and the surgical care plans and interventions and operation notes. So it took us about a year to install CHA-A, 9 months to install, a year to install Opera, 9 months to install CHA-A, with a gap in between to rescope CHA-A as some things had moved on in the interim. So our setup now is we have Centricity Opera, which is our theatre management system, and that brings with us the usual scheduling, reporting, and surgical data capture features. And we report both locally and nationally with data that comes out of that system. That is now married to the CHA-A anaesthetic EPR, which we also use in the post-anaesthesia care unit. When we first installed Opera, we did have some challenges, particularly around having multiple user groups trying to enter data into the system at the same time, which I was not very happy with. Adding the CHA-A package to that, it was a big leap forwards in terms of functionality and efficiency for us, because we were able to share the burden of documentation between the two systems and share data between them at the same time. So what does it look like in reality? So top left, you'll see the Opera interface. That usually has two base displays which is used by clinicians. The one you see, if this works, sorry. The one you see, this one, is the one that's used by clinicians in theatre. It's specific to the theatre that you're working in. It gives you the usual scheduling information and is what the nurses will use to document any surgical pathway information as they go along, and from where the surgeons will generate an operation note. There's also a theatre overview display which the coordinators and administrators will use to monitor progress of multiple theatre suites, theatres through the day. At the bottom you see our CHA-A EPR home screen. That takes scheduling data from Opera, as you see in top right, and allows us to capture a fully fledged EPR, bringing all the patient information during their theatre episode into that. We have interfaces between the two systems set up, obviously, and we send timestamp data from CHA-A to Opera. That's been a big step forwards in terms of the accuracy and reliability of data, because it tends to be entered in real time or close to real time by the anaesthesiologists, who are usually actually paying attention to that. Historically, it was done by the nursing staff retrospectively and a bit more likely to be ad hoc. And we've, I'm sure, all seen the surgeon leave the operating table, say that he's finished, and leave his registrar sewing up for another 20 minutes afterwards. So it removes that aspect of it. The directionality of data flow is dependent upon the workflows we have set up. So in some settings, for example, obstetrics, we have the timestamp data coming from Opera to CHA. That's because the anesthesiologists are too busy to be doing in real-time data entry at that point. So it's very flexible in terms of how you set it up. So some insights into the configuration required to make this all work, and my hints and tips about doing it. it's essential you have clinician engagement when you're configuring a system for use in your own department. I think different patient or different staff groups think differently about how you would wish to document and the standard documentation that's required. So you really need your own anaesthesiologists heavily involved in the configuration of the anaesthesia system, and we had the recovery nurses or PACU nurses involved in developing the PACU system, and that's been very helpful. From a workflow analysis point of view, that refers to working out the workflows through the system of the patient journey. Initially, I thought we would have lots of different workflows. I'd need one for each specialty, one for majors, one for minors. The more we thought about it, that ultimately boiled down to all those patients essentially were having the same journey with differing degrees of documentation. So we now have just 4 workflows, which you see in the top there. There was an extra one because it's a test system, but and those relate to the patient's physical journey through the system and the nomenclature of the timestamps. And also the directionality of data flow. So we have flow from the anaesthetic room to theatre, where induction happens in a separate room, flow in theatre, where everything happens in the same room, a local anaesthetic workflow, which is stripped back and has a lot less mandatory data time points for just local anaesthesia cases, and the obstetric workflow, which has data travelling in the opposite direction and allows us to have different default setups for that particular group of patients. Familiarity refers to keeping the system as like your previous system as you could, to drive adoption and happiness with my colleagues. We would always been fairly happy really with the standard of documentation and the detail that was recorded in our paper chart, so I tried to replicate that as much as possible without going back and reinventing the wheel, and tried to keep the data documentation workflow as close to what we had always done as possible. So a way to document everything, but not necessarily force anyone to document anything extra. From a simplicity point of view, there's a balance to be struck between an organisational desire to have lots of checklists and mandatory data points, forcing the clinician to have a kind of complete data set, versus the clinician's desire to have something that's light and easy to use and doesn't force, not too many forced stop points as you go along the way, to make it quick to get the minimum data set in and get through the list. What that resulted in is, for us, is a very minimal number of mandatory data points, and those are largely the timestamps that feed to Opera, some basic anaesthesia technique descriptors that feed to Opera and therefore the operation note, and some post-op instructions. It's obviously possible to enter a vast amount of data beyond that, but that's where you have to get in to get through a case. Ease of use is on a similar spectrum to that, but that was about trying to work out how we enable documentation of all the data that is required with as few clicks as possible. And for us, that was about leveraging defaults, and these are a kind of very powerful tool whereby I can create a default set of default documentation set for individual procedures or interventions. So you'll see here I have just an example of our peripheral block defaults. If I select one of those, it will give the intervention display here, and you see all the blue boxes that are filled and already pre-configured. So all I need to do is add the side that I'd performed the procedure on and how easy it was, and save it. So 3 clicks instead of kind of 10 or 12. We needed to make enough defaults to be useful, but not so many that it's overwhelming. And I now encourage my colleagues to find the default that's closest to what they want to do. So it's just 1 or 2 clicks to change those data points you need to make it true. It's a very powerful tool. Output. So when you're designing it, and I did this the wrong way around myself, but you need to think about what you need to get out of the system before you design what goes into the system. The way that the input displays are designed is very much grouped, and you need to think about how you want to get it out. So make sure you put the grouping correctly in the displays in the first place. It's much easier to edit and adjust the system before it's got live patient data in it. So you really want to think about what you want to get out. These are just examples of some of the types of data that we pull out, but I'll show you a complete record in a minute. So what does our hardware setup look like in the real world? We spent a lot of time in the planning phase in testing and trialing different hardware options, and we've ended up with a system that's on the bottom right is our in-theatre setup. So we have a 23-inch touchscreen PC with a keyboard tray and a magnetic keyboard so it doesn't fall off, a mouse that can stand being bounced off the floor fairly regularly, and an adjustable arm that it's mounted on so it can be used for all staff regardless of height and whether you're sitting or standing. That's been really successful, really popular with my colleagues, as well as being brilliant for running the EPR on. It's just as useful for sifting through your emails or checking the news in between cases, so a big win for multifunctional use. You'll see that we have not added that in our induction rooms or in our post-anaesthesia care unit, where the burden of documentation is much less, and a standard kind of desktop PC has been perfectly adequate in those settings. There are a number of extra features that were required, so we've had to introduce barcode scanners to every machine, and that's because to make the data flow through the system, it needs to be tagged with a patient ID. So the only mandatory point is that when the patient arrives, you use a barcode scanner to put their patient identifier number into this device, into the monitor, and into this module, which then follows the patient on their journey through the theatre. So that module from the induction room into the theatre and then onto the recovery area effectively represents the patient through that journey. And as long as the KI number at the start is correct, their data flow is continuous. And that's been a big win. The barcode readers are essential because it removes transcription errors. And we had, initially my colleagues were so enthusiastic, they were plugging in the number manually before the patient arrived, and every now and again they'd sort of transpose two numbers, and obviously nothing works if that happens. So barcodes are useful. And finally on the top, you'll see a couple of additional devices that we needed to add on, and that facilitates adding some extra gadgets onto the side of the system. Those are slung on each anaesthetic machine down here out the way. I'll mention those more afterwards. So you might be wondering how this has all gone down with my colleagues and how painful it is to launch. I have 41 permanent clinicians, 24 rotating or training staff, and about 200 combined anaesthesia nurses, recovery staff and theatre scrub nurses. Before the initial launch, we had dedicated classroom sessions for all those staff, depending on their level of interaction with the system. Very rapidly, we've scaled that back for new staff to some online self-directed e-learning modules and one or two cases with a sort of side-by-side with a colleague when you start. The system is very intuitive to use. The learning curve is steep but short, and the vast majority of new anaesthetists to the department are comfortable using it within kind of one or two cases. It's been really much easier than I thought it would be going forwards. I do, of course, like all departments, have my challenges, which is why I've got my Statler and my Waldorf here, and I'm sure you'll recognise those from your own department. But even those guys have generally got on with it. Occasionally I get some constructive criticism. Occasionally I have to provide a little bit of additional support. But by and large, even they just use it and are happy enough. So what are the advantages of having an anaesthesia EPR? This is how I think about it myself in terms of black box recording, easy access to recent records, automated output, and data. I'll go through these individually. So black box recording, my colleagues often refer to this as the black box of what happens in theatre. And the way that data is captured is central to the beauty of the whole system. The vast majority of continuous data parameters, so such as you see in the top right with patient vital signs, ventilator data, gas data, is all captured through a cloud-based system once it's tagged with the patient KI number from that start point. And that aspect of the system just works. All the data appears. You don't have to do anything to get it there. We have some additional devices like TCI pumps, infusion devices, cardiac output monitors, those sort of things. Those require a manual Ethernet cable to be plugged into the Mural Connect device, which is the thing that I showed you slung on the side of the anaesthetic machine. And then a couple of software clicks to add those devices to the system. And from that point on, they also will continually inject continuous data. And the frames you see lower down here is some cardiac output data that's pulled into the system and some target-controlled infusion device system that's pulled as well. That aspect of things also works very well. It just takes a couple of clicks to get it set up. The gap you see in data at the bottom is where the cable's been unplugged to move the patient from the induction room into theatre and then plug them back in again. The beauty of this overall system is that the data that's captured is believable. true and accurate, and that's a really powerful tool when it comes to M&M, morbidity and mortality analysis afterwards. I'm sure you're all familiar with the paper charts, which I always regarded as an artist's impression of what happens during a case, and you'll have seen them with the peaks are sort of pulled down a bit and the troughs are pulled up a bit. At least this way I know what's on there is true. From access to records, this is fairly self-explanatory, but the system will automatically generate records from the different phases of care at the end. And this is a screenshot of our local clinical portal system, and you can see a number of anaesthetic records in there. I'm going to try and show you completed records, so just bear with me for a second. So this is the sort of output you get from, that one. Sort of output you get from the system. That's just a copy of the PDF from a dummy case that I've generated. You see at the top we have the summary of the pre-operative discussion. As we go down, we get into the intra-anaesthesia record, summaries of various interventions. I'm not going to make you read the whole thing. You can see there's an awful lot of text in there. That has not been entered manually. That's all text that is generated by a couple of clicks. So you can have a very complete record with very limited data point entry. As you keep going further, keep going further down, you get into the graphical trend frames that have been captured during, just as you see in the live record. And that will pull all the same sort of data that you see in the live system. It's a very useful tool. My colleagues often comment on the utility of being able to see what happened in recent cases without having to have physical access to the patient's notes. So very helpful. I'll not show you the rest. Automated prints is a variation on that theme. So as well as having defaulted reports that are produced for every case, we've also been able to generate some customized reports. So for this example, we've generated an airway alert. So if I have a difficult intubation at the beginning of a case, plug all the data into the relevant airway intervention field. When I get to the end of the case, when I'm hit end case, I just also select airway alert, and it will automatically generate a pre-templated letter. Historically, we'd have had to print off a form, fill that in, post a copy to the patient, post a copy to the GP, and then have my secretarial staff transcribe that back into an electronic version and upload it. Now, with one click, I can generate a PDF that appears in this system and is automatically sent to the patient's GP, and we'll print a physical copy to give to the patient. I'm going to try and show you that as well. Just, clicked the wrong button. I've got the link, not the PDF. So, you see here a copy of our report. So the top bit is a templated letter that we've pre-produced, and that gives some instructions to the general practitioner to enter some diagnostic codes. So when the patients are referred back into hospital, that information is available. And then further down that record, you'll see it has pulled the various data points from the intervention field. That's been a really useful tool, and we've used that quite a few times in anger now. And it saves a lot of hassle on the day. So data. Going forwards, the real power of this system will be what we can get out of it again. We're capturing thousands of data points a day, I think, now from this. And these pictures are just some examples of what my data services colleagues are doing in terms of trying to interpret that data warehouse. It all lives on a local server. It's not the most obvious system to interrogate, but they are learning how to link different parameters together so they can write the correct search strings to pull data out of that. And I think GE do now have a tool that will automate a lot of that for us. We haven't got that yet. But going forwards, by having spent a year installing this clinically, the next year is going to be all about getting data out that so we can use it to leverage quality improvement work and generate some dashboards going forwards. So the challenges of doing a system or installing a system like this, has obviously not been without its issues. I think of these most of the issues around the edges of the system where it contacts the real world. By borders, I mean where data is moving from an analog point into the system, and then again at the end of the case where it's moving back out. For an anaesthetist, that's often in the morning when you meet your patient and you want to jot a few notes about your discussion you had with them. A lot of my colleagues still find it simplest to do that on a piece of paper and then transcribe it intra-op, which is obviously not my ideal, but it works. And then at the end of the case, we send the patient back out to the ward area. We've generated lots of electronic records of this, but the ward environment doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to facilitate handover at a PC screen at each patient area. So they've been printing out a physical copy as well as that digital copy. So our goal of having a paper-light or paperless system has been nobbled initially. We're probably actually generating more paper than we did beforehand. Just in the last few weeks, we've installed a fleet of workstations on wheels, or what I call chowows, which are out in the ward area now, used by some of my colleagues in the morning, so they can review an electronic pre-op form and enter the discussions in real time into chow with those. And those are farmed out into the ward area later in the day to facilitate handover at the end of the day. And in the next couple of weeks, we hope to stop generating those paper reports. Connections is just about getting your colleagues to make sure to plug the correct cables into the right ports, put the right KI number in with a barcode scanner. Some people had to make every mistake themselves before they stopped making them. So obviously didn't do this all myself. I had a lot of support from other people through the hospital along the way, in addition to our local IT project team and the GE project team. I have to say the GE team were great, but medical physics team in particular outdid themselves, and they are definitely blurring the lines now between hardware, software and networking. And actually since this project they've begun to develop hybrid roles within their own department to facilitate these sort of projects going forwards. So I was doing it again, or if any of you were going to be doing a project like this, my advice overall is you want the system to be configured by a clinician. You want to keep it as simple as you can, familiar, and nice light workflows. You want to find the people in your organization that can help you with the networking, with the hardware, with all the design you need. You need to work at the edges of the system to smooth that journey into and out of the analog digital interface. You need to spend time and money on the interfaces, because your colleagues will want a system that looks nice, is comfortable, easy to use, and gives them some added perks on the side. You want to test, and test more, and you will still have things that do not survive confrontation with reality, and watch out for those. And then finally, you want to book a nice long holiday 2 weeks after it launches. I went to California for 3 weeks to see some family, came back slightly apprehensive about what I was going to find, and I needn't have worried because it was business as usual. My colleagues had just got on with it, and everything was working fine. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you for taking your time.